Imagine a single man whose actions were, so devastating and so completely world-altering that he actually caused a measurable drop in the Earth's global temperature.
Yeah, it sounds like science fiction, but it's a real documented anomaly.
Right. We are talking about scrubbing something like 700 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere.
Hmm.
And this was centuries before the Industrial Revolution.
It's just staggering to think about.
It really is. Today, we are exploring the mind-bending reality of an outcast. A kid who went from eating field mice to survive a frozen winter to literally architecting the largest contiguous land empire in human history.
Absolutely. We are dissecting the legacy of a man whose dominions span roughly 12 million square miles.
Which is just, it's hard to even picture that.
It is. To put it into perspective, you are looking at an empire stretching from the shores of the Pacific Ocean all the way across to the borders of Eastern Europe, covering nearly 22% of the Earth's surface.
Wow. And to understand how one individual achieved that, we're going to be pulling from a deeply varied stack of sources for this deep dive.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating mix today. We're looking at the oldest surviving Mongolian text, The Secret History of the Mongols, to get an intimate look at his early life.
Right, which gives us that personal narrative.
Exactly. But we will combine that with modern military logistical analyses. Plus, we have genetic studies from the Jerusalem Post and even macroeconomic research from the Richmond Fed regarding his impact on global trade.
And of course, the modern climate data that tracks that incredible environmental anomaly we just mentioned at the top.
Right. It's a very comprehensive stack.
So the mission for this deep dive is to really dissect the incredibly complex and often deeply contradictory legacy of Genghis Khan, born Temujin.
Because the historical memory is so divided.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Was he the bloodthirsty destroyer that so much of the world remembers? Or, was he an unparalleled military strategist?
Or perhaps a visionary administrator who effectively connected the East and the West for the very first time.
Right. If you were listening to this, you might think you know Genghis Khan as just the ultimate barbarian.
Yeah.
A guy who just burned cities and rode off into the ash.
Which is the popular culture image, yeah.
But by the end of this deep dive, you'll see how his radical ideas on extreme meritocracy, global trade networks, and psychological warfare still echoed directly into the systems we live in today.
They absolutely do. But to understand the empire he built, we really can't start with the conquests. We have to start with the trauma that forged the architect.
Right, we have to go back to the beginning.
Yeah, we have to travel back to the brutal, unforgiving realities of the 12th century Mongolian steppe.
Let's set the scene, because the physical environment here is basically a character in its own right. We are talking about the year 1162, near the Onan River.
The environment there is incredibly harsh.
Yeah, the temperature swings are lethal, the wind is just relentless, and a boy is born named Temujin, which translates to of iron or blacksmith.
A very fitting name, as it turns out.
Definitely. And the society he is born into operates on what looks to us like just institutionalized chaos.
Yeah.
His father, Yutsuge, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan.
Right, but the way Yusuge acquired his primary wife, Holun, who is Temujin's mother, it really tells you everything you need to know about the baseline of this world.
It was wild. He literally kidnapped her from another tribe.
He did, and while bride theft is obviously a horrifying concept to a modern observer, on the 12th century steppe, it was actually a recognized socio-political mechanism.
Wait, recognized? Like people just accepted it?
Well, accepted in the sense that this was a stateless society. There was no central government, no overarching law enforcement, no formal courts to settle disputes.
So it's just pure survival of the fittest.
Exactly. Survival depended entirely on your aristocratic lineage, your clan, and the protection that specific network afforded you.
I see.
It was a world locked in seemingly endless generational cycles of blood feuds, resource raiding, and retribution. You stole a bride, they stole your horses, you killed their brother, they poisoned your father.
Which brings us to the inciting incident of his whole life. When Temujin is just 9 years old, his father is poisoned by a rival group, the Tatars.
Yes.
And from what I understand of the sources, this wasn't like an assassination in the dark. It was incredibly insidious.
It was disguised as steppe hospitality, which makes it so much worse. Yasuke was traveling and stopped at a Tatar camp.
And you can't just refuse hospitality, right?
No, the cultural rules of the steppe strictly dictated that travelers must be offered food, and travelers must accept it.
Wow. So he's trapped by tradition.
Exactly. The Tatars recognized him as an old enemy, fed him poisoned food, and he rode away, taking days to slowly die on his journey home.
That is brutal. So the father dies, And the brutal logic of the step immediately kicks in. The clan doesn't rally around the grieving widow.
Not at all.
Instead, a rival clan, the Taishud, decides to seize power. They violently expel Yasuge's widow, Holing, and her 7 children.
Just cast them out completely.
Yeah, they strip them of all their livestock, their protection, their access to the traditional nomadic diet of mutton and horse's milk. They abandon a mother and 7 children in the frozen wilderness to die.
Sociologists often refer to this specific kind of exile in a tribal society as social death.
Social death, that's a heavy term.
It is, because your physical death is just expected to follow shortly after. In a world where your identity, your caloric intake, and your physical safety are entirely predicated on your family name.
Right.
Being abandoned taught Temujin a harrowing, permanent lesson. Hereditary privilege meant absolutely nothing when the winter wind hit. A noble title does not produce body heat.
Man, I am trying to wrap my head around the daily reality of that survival. The secret history of the Mongols paints this incredibly bleak picture.
It's very grim.
Hulin and her kids are out there scrounging for wild garlic, picking berries, catching small fish in the river, just trying to stave off starvation day by day.
They are living on the absolute brink.
And it's in the middle of this desperate caloric deficit that we see a moment that really defines Temujin. He and his brother Khazar murder their older half-brother Better.
Yes. The text details that the conflict arose over a dispute regarding food, specifically a small fish and a bird they had managed to catch.
Hold on. I struggle with this detail every time I encounter it. We're talking about a child, maybe a young teenager at this point.
Around 13 or 14, yes.
I get that the step is brutal, but murdering your own brother over a minnow? How does a military historian or a sociologist look at that and see anything other than the early warning signs of a psychopath?
It's a fair question.
Like, how is this not just pure innate cruelty?
It is a shocking event, certainly, but you have to view it through the lens of pure survival mechanics, not our modern morality.
Okay, unpack that for me.
In the context of extreme lethal deprivation, Better, as the older half-brother, was beginning to assert physical dominance. He was hoarding the meager resources they found.
So he was becoming a liability to the group.
Exactly. For Temujin, who had just realized that survival required absolute unity and control, Better was a source of internal division. A divided camp in the Mongolian winter is a dead camp.
That makes a terrifying kind of sense.
From a psychological perspective, the assassination of his brother wasn't random violence. It was a calculated, ruthless consolidation of power within a microsociety that simply could not afford internal friction.
He learns that hesitation equals death. If there's a threat to the cohesion of the unit, you just eliminate the threat immediately.
Precisely. And his trials were far from over. Shortly after this, he is actually hunted down and captured by the very clan that abandoned him, the Taishud.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they enslave him, and to ensure he can't escape, they force him to wear a king.
I looked up what a king is, and it is an absolute nightmare. It's essentially a heavy wooden board with a hole for your neck and sometimes your hands.
Right, it's a portable pillory.
Exactly. Imagine the physical and psychological toll of that.
Yeah.
You cannot feed yourself. You cannot swat away a fly. You cannot lie down to sleep comfortably.
It restricts your movement completely, chafes the skin raw, and degrades you constantly in front of your captors.
So the secret history details that he endures this patiently. He doesn't panic. He waits for the exact right moment during a feast when his guard is distracted.
He was incredibly observant.
Then he uses the very heavy wooden board locked around his neck as a weapon, knocks the guard unconscious, hides in a river breathing through a reed, and makes this daring escape.
And these stories of survival, enduring the social death, surviving the wilderness, escaping the Kang, they began to build a very specific reputation for him.
Like a myth in the making.
Yes. On the steppe, people started to view him not just as the survivor, but as someone with an almost supernatural resilience. Someone favored by Tengri, the eternal blue sky.
But amidst all this iron-willed, almost mythological survival, the text includes these incredibly grounded quirks. Like, it specifically notes that young Temujin was terrified of dogs.
Which is a brilliant inclusion by the authors of The Secret History.
It really is. It humanizes him so much.
It reminds us that before he was a monolithic historical conqueror, he was just a traumatized kid trying to navigate a terrifying, hostile world.
And that trauma forged a man who, fundamentally, deep in his bones, distrusted the old ways of the steppe. The aristocratic system had completely failed him.
It nearly killed him.
Right. The idea that bloodlines meant you were loyal or capable was proven totally false when his own tribe left him to freeze. So when he finally begins to gain a following, he decides to completely shatter the traditional Mongol wheel.
But breaking that wheel was not a swift process by any means. It involved decades of complex alliances, strategic marriages, betrayals, and a protracted, brutal civil war.
Let's focus on the biggest betrayal of that civil war.
Okay.
His war against his own blood brother, Jamuka. They were Anda, right?
Yes, Anda.
Childhood friends who made vows of eternal brotherhood.
Yeah, the bond of an Anda was considered even stronger than biological brotherhood on the steppe. You exchanged gifts, you mingled your blood, you swore to protect each other forever.
And for a time, they really did. They fought alongside each other to rescue Temujin's wife, Borte, after she was kidnapped by the Merkits.
They were a powerful team initially.
But as they grew older, gathered followers, and actually gained political power, their visions for the future collided violently. What was the core ideological split between these two best friends?
It was a fundamental disagreement on how society should be structured. Jamuka was the traditionalist. He represented the old guard.
He liked the system the way it was.
Exactly. He wanted to preserve the aristocratic system where lineage dictated power, where the noble clans maintained their hereditary privileges.
But Temujin, having been betrayed and enslaved by that very aristocracy, championed a radical new world of strict meritocracy.
Yes, Temujin knew firsthand that a noble title doesn't mean you know how to fight or lead or survive.
Right, because the nobles left him to die. He was actively drawing in the marginalized, the outcasts, the lower status individuals, and promoting them strictly based on their actual battlefield skills.
And this deeply alienated the traditional nobility. They flocked to Jamuka. So this civil war wasn't just about territory or resources. It was a war over the fundamental social fabric of the Mongol people.
Would they remain a fractured hierarchy of entitled nobles or become a unified engine of merit?
Exactly. And it took decades. He actually lost to Jamuka early on, spent years in exile, but he grinds his way back.
By 1206, he systematically defeats every rival confederation. The Tatars, the Naimans, the Merkits. But the way he handles the victory over the Tatars, the tribe that poisoned his father, is where we see his terrifying pragmatism.
The Tatar campaign perfectly illustrates his dual nature of genocidal ruthlessness and strategic assimilation.
Tell me about the wagon axle.
Upon defeating them, he ordered the execution of all Tatar males who were taller than a wagon axle.
Meaning he wiped out the entire adult and teenage male population. Anyone old enough to remember the old tribal identity or hold a grudge was just executed.
It was a systematic elimination of future resistance. But simultaneously, he took a Tatar infant and gave it to his own mother, Holin, to raise as her own son.
Wait, think about the psychological whiplash of that for his own followers. You just ordered your men to slaughter thousands of Tatar men?
Right.
And in the next breath, you hand a Tatar baby to the matriarch of your own family and say, he's one of us now. How do his generals even process that?
They processed it because it was a loud, unmistakable symbol. It signaled that the old Tatar identity was dead, but the surviving people, the women, the young children, were now fundamentally inextricably part of his family, his new society.
That is just intense.
He formalized this entire new societal structure in 1206 at a massive assembly called a Kurultai, where he was officially proclaimed Genghis Khan, translating to universal ruler.
And this is the moment he initiates what historians call a total social revolution. He realizes that if he just leaves the old tribes intact, if the Naimans still live together, if the remaining Tatars still camp together, they'll just rebel again the second he shows weakness.
So he abolishes the old tribal names completely.
He restructured the entire civilian and military population into a massive decimal system.
Yes. Every man was conscripted into units of 10 called an arban. 10 of those formed a zun of 100. 10 of those formed a mayangan of 1,000. And 10 of those formed a tumen of 10,000.
But the genius was in how he populated the arban. He took a warrior from the Merkits, a warrior from the Tatars, a warrior from his own Borjigin clan, and forced them to live, eat, and fight in the same 10-man tent.
He essentially invented the ultimate corporate restructure, but with swords.
I love that analogy. Think about how modern organizations struggle to break down internal silos. He shattered them by completely obliterating their previous identities.
It was a brilliant mechanism of forced integration. Your loyalty was no longer to your uncle, your clan leader, or your historic bloodline.
It was to the squad.
Exactly. Your survival now depended entirely on the 9 other men in your arban. And the enforcement of this loyalty was absolute.
If one man in an arban fled from battle, the other 9 were executed. If an entire arban of 10 fled, The Zun of 100 was executed.
It bound their fates together completely. You fought to protect the man next to you because if he ran, you died.
But it wasn't a system built purely on the threat of the sword, was it?
No, Genghis Khan instituted unprecedented social welfare to secure their proactive loyalty. He decreed that the widows and orphans of fallen soldiers would receive their fair share of the loot from any conquests.
Which is massive. Think about the primary fear of a medieval soldier. If I die on this battlefield, my family starves.
Right.
By guaranteeing the economic survival of their families, he bought a level of absolute, unwavering devotion that traditional kings could never afford.
He replaced familial loyalty with loyalty to the state. And he proved his commitment to this meritocracy continuously.
There's a famous story about this, right?
Yes, one of the most famous examples recorded in the sources involves an enemy archer during a fierce battle against the Taijut tribe.
The story of Jebi. This is incredible. Set the scene for us.
Genghis Khan is in the fit of combat, and his horse is suddenly shot out from under him by an enemy arrow. He is thrown to the ground, nearly killed.
A huge moment of vulnerability.
Exactly. After the battle is won, Genghis lines up the prisoners of war and demands to know who fired the shot.
Now, any other conqueror in history would have made an example of him in the most agonizing way possible.
A young enemy soldier bravely steps forward. He fully expects to be tortured and executed on the spot, but he admits he fired the arrow.
But Genghis Khan looks at him, recognizes the man's sheer boldness and his undeniable lethal skill with a composite bow,
Right.
and instead of killing him, makes him an officer in his own army. He even renames him Jebi, which means arrow.
And Jebi goes on to become one of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, leading campaigns across Asia.
Along with Subutai, right?
Yes, Subutai, who was the son of a lowly blacksmith and who would ultimately become arguably the greatest field commander in human history, coordinating massive invasions across multiple continents simultaneously.
By prioritizing actual skill over aristocratic status, Genghis Khan tapped into a massive reservoir of human talent that the old system had actively suppressed.
It was a true meritocracy.
So, by the early 13th century, he has forged this completely restructured, hyper-loyal, merit-based society. The question then becomes, how does this newly forged society translate to the battlefield?
It translated into a military machine that was structurally centuries ahead of its time. When we analyze the raw numbers, it's actually astonishing.
Here's the numbers.
Genghis Khan eventually ruled over hundreds of millions of people, but his standing army rarely exceeded 100,000 men.
100,000 men. That is the seating capacity of a large college football stadium. And they conquered the known world. How is that mathematically, physically possible?
It comes down to a trinity of technology, tactics, and logistics that completely negated the numerical superiority of any enemy they faced.
Let's start with the tech.
Let's start with the technological foundation, the composite recurve bow.
This is not just a curved piece of wood with a string. Explain the physics of this weapon, because it's a marvel of engineering.
The Mongol bow was constructed by laminating different materials together. The core was wood, but they glued animal horn to the belly of the bow, the side facing the archer.
Okay, why horn?
Horn is incredibly resistant to compression. Then, they glued animal sinew to the back of the bow, which has immense tensile strength and resists stretching.
So when you draw the string back, you are fighting the physical properties of two completely different animal materials that desperately want to snap back into their original shape.
Exactly. It creates a terrifying amount of potential energy. This allowed a relatively compact bow, small enough to be fired easily from horseback, to shoot armor-piercing or flaming arrows up to 350 yards.
350 yards. That is the length of 3.5 football fields.
Yeah.
And they were firing these with lethal accuracy while riding at a full gallop.
Meanwhile, their enemies in Europe and Asia, the knights, the heavy infantry, are bogged down in heavy chainmail and rigid formations.
The Mongols wore lightweight chain or hardened leather, right?
Right. They could literally ride circles around a traditional army, showering them with arrows from a distance where the enemy's weapons couldn't even reach them.
But their true secret weapon, the logistical advantage that defeated every other empire, was the elimination of the supply line.
It changed everything about how war was fought.
The Romans, the Chinese dynasties, the Crusaders, they all moved at the speed of their ox-drawn supply wagons. If the wagons got stuck in the mud, or if the enemy burned the grain stores, the army stopped, starved, and died.
The Mongols were a nomadic army. They did not rely on slow, vulnerable supply trains. They lived off the land.
How many horses did they have?
Each soldier traveled with a string of 3 to 5 horses, allowing them to switch mounts mid-gallop to keep moving without exhausting the animals.
So they never had to stop. What did the men eat?
For food, they carried tightly packed dried meat, they hunted constantly, and they drank fermented mare's milk known as kumis.
And when they were pushing through a desert or executing a rapid flanking maneuver where they couldn't stop to hunt, they used a survival tactic that sounds like something out of a horror movie.
It is quite visceral. In extreme emergencies, a Mongol soldier would make a small, precise incision in the jugular vein of one of his horses.
Oh, man.
He would drink a small amount of the horse's blood, sometimes mixing it with water, and then close the wound. It sustained the rider with protein and hydration without having to stop and without killing the mount.
They were an army that physically did not need to stop to eat. This hypermobility allowed them to execute battlefield tactics that were devastating. And the most famous of these is the Mangudai, the feigned retreat.
The feigned retreat is notoriously one of the most difficult maneuvers in military history to pull off successfully.
Because it looks like you're losing.
Right. The Mongols would aggressively engage an enemy line, and then suddenly they would break formation and flee in apparent chaotic panic.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Faking panic is incredibly dangerous because pretending to run away can very quickly trigger an actual terrified rout among your own men.
Exactly. Fear is contagious.
How did they pull off this choreography? Sometimes they retreated for days, drawing the enemy out over miles of terrain. How do you coordinate that without modern communications?
It speaks entirely to the absolute discipline instilled by that decimal system we discussed earlier. They had spent their entire lives hunting together on the steppe in those exact same units of 10, 100, and 1,000.
It's muscle memory for them.
Yes. They communicated across miles of terrain through a highly sophisticated system of signaling flags, horns, and whistling arrows, arrows designed with hollow bone heads that emitted a piercing shriek in flight.
So they retreat. The enemy sees the Mongols running, thinks they've won, breaks their defensive formation, and chases them.
They draw the enemy forces out, stretching the enemy's lines until the horses are exhausted and the infantry is completely disorganized.
And then what?
And then, upon a single signal, a specific flag drop, or a whistling arrow, the Mongols would wheel their horses around in perfect, terrifying unison. They would encircle the overextended, exhausted enemy and systematically destroy them.
It's like watching a flock of starlings suddenly change direction in the sky, but with armor-piercing arrows.
It was deadly choreography.
But there's a logistical problem here. 100,000 guys on horses, no matter how fast they shoot, physically cannot tear down the 50-foot stone walls of massive cities in China and Persia. A recurved bow does nothing to a stone wall.
Which is where Genghis Khan's supreme pragmatism shines again. He didn't stubbornly throw his cavalry against stone walls like earlier nomadic raiders did. He adapted immediately.
How so?
When he captured Chinese and Persian siege engineers, he didn't execute them. He integrated them into his war machine. He ordered them to build catapults, massive counterweight trebuchets, and early gunpowder weapons.
They completely assimilated the cutting-edge siege technology of the very people they were conquering.
They learned from everyone they fought.
But they also employed siege tactics that were deeply, uncomfortably dark, like the Karash.
Yes, the Karash was the use of a human shield.
So grim.
During sieges, the Mongols would round up local prisoners, peasants from the surrounding countryside, or surrendered enemy soldiers, and force them to march at the very front of the Mongol assault on the walls.
That is horrifying. You are forcing the city's defenders to shoot their own farmers, their own cousins, while the Mongol warriors advance safely behind them.
It was psychological warfare as much as physical.
And there are even wilder legends about how they dealt with stubborn cities, like the story of the birds and the cats.
According to some chronicles, when a fortified city refused to surrender, the Mongols would ask for a seemingly strange tribute, thousands of live birds and cats.
Which sounds completely harmless at first.
Right. But once the city handed them over, the Mongols allegedly tied flaming tufts of cotton to the animals' tails and released them.
Obviously, the animals panic.
The panicked animals naturally fled back into the city to their nests and roofs, setting the entire wooden infrastructure ablaze.
Whether that is a literal historical event or a vivid metaphor for their destructive cunning, it perfectly illustrates the psychological reality of facing the Mongol horde.
They fought a total war.
While European knights were still obsessing over chivalry, capturing nobles for ransom, and fighting according to a gentleman's code, the Mongols were concerned with only one thing: the total annihilation of the enemy's capacity to resist.
And that reality necessitates a difficult transition in our deep dive, because fast horses, composite bows, and catapults alone do not explain how entire massive empires collapsed before the Mongols even drew their weapons.
Right. To conquer the world, Genghis Khan had to invent a weapon that traveled faster than his cavalry.
His most devastating weapon wasn't the arrow, it was the mind.
We have to confront the weaponization of terror.
The demographic numbers associated with the Mongol conquests are difficult to even conceptualize. We are talking about an estimated 35 to 40 million deaths across Eurasia.
To put that into perspective, they reduced the global human population of the 13th century by roughly 11%. That is an almost incomprehensible demographic catastrophe.
Entire regions, centuries of civilization simply erased.
And the stories that came out of these conquests are the stuff of apocalyptic nightmares. Take the legend of Nishapur, a thriving, massive cultural center in modern-day Iran.
Yes, the Nishapur accounts are infamous.
Rumors recorded by historians at the time claim that when the Mongols breached the city, they slaughtered 1,748,000 people in a single hour.
It's an astronomical figure.
Okay, let's stop and apply some basic critical thinking and math to that claim. To kill 1.7 million people in 1 hour, the Mongol forces would have to be killing roughly 29,133 people every single minute, 60 seconds.
Right, the logistics don't add up.
That is logistically and physically impossible without modern weapons of mass destruction. So the math is garbage. Why did historians write it down?
Because the fact that people believed it, the fact that scribes recorded it as truth, highlights the sheer scale of the horror the Mongols inflicted. It felt like 1 million people were dying an hour.
So it was about the impression of scale.
But the crucial point to understand is that the brutality was not random, mindless chaos. It was a highly calibrated, systematic psychological tool. Genghis Khan operated on a strict, binary diplomatic strategy: submit immediately and pay tribute, or be completely destroyed.
And if you submitted, things were actually relatively stable. But if you resisted... Let's walk through the invasion of the Khwarezmid Empire, because this is the prime example of his terror strategy.
Yeah.
Genghis Khan actually sent envoys to the Khwarezmid Shah initially to establish peaceful trade along the Silk Road, right?
He did. He wanted an economic relationship. But the governor of a Khwarezmid border city seized the Mongol caravan, stole their goods, and executed the envoys, believing them to be spies.
A terrible decision.
Genghis Khan, showing surprising restraint, sent a second group of ambassadors, diplomats, to the Shah to demand justice and the governor's head.
And how did the Shah respond?
The Shah responded by executing the lead ambassador and shaving the beards of the others, sending them back to Genghis Khan in utter disgrace.
You do not shave the beards of Genghis Khan's ambassadors. It was a fatal empire-ending miscalculation.
Genghis Khan marshaled his forces, crossed the mountains, and unleashed the full, unbridled fury of his war machine on the Khwarezmid Empire.
And it was total devastation.
The devastation was systematic and total. This is when we see the erasure of cities like Merv, a jewel of the Islamic world, where hundreds of thousands were methodically slaughtered.
Just wiped off the map?
Libraries were burned to ash complex, ancient irrigation systems were intentionally destroyed, turning fertile land back into desert.
He also completely exterminated the Tangut royal family simply because they refused his order to supply auxiliary troops for that very campaign. It was an absolute zero-tolerance policy for defiance.
None whatsoever.
But why the theatrical level of cruelty? Why stack skulls into pyramids?
What's fascinating is the brutal logic behind the terror. The Mongols lacked the raw manpower to permanently occupy every hostile city they encountered across Asia and the Middle East.
Right. They couldn't just leave soldiers everywhere.
They couldn't leave garrisons of 10,000 men in every town they'd run out of soldiers before they reached Persia. So they relied on what historians call exemplary massacres.
Meaning they would absolutely obliterate one city that resisted, kill the men, enslave the women, burn the buildings, but they would intentionally let a few survivors flee.
Yes. They would purposefully allow a handful of traumatized survivors to escape into the desert and flee to the next city, carrying the horrific, exaggerated tales of what the Mongols had done.
The terror acted like a contagion.
Exactly. By the time the Mongol army actually arrived at the gates of the next city, the population was already paralyzed by fear. Many massive, heavily fortified cities simply opened their gates and surrendered without firing a single arrow, choosing submission over the absolute certainty of annihilation.
They also actively utilized visual deception to compound this fear.
They were masters of it.
They would light 5 campfires per soldier at night to make their encampments look vastly larger than they were. They would tie branches to the tails of their horses and ride in circles to kick up massive dust clouds, making it look like an endless horde was approaching the city walls.
So this raises a vital question about how we interpret history. How much of this terror was actual physical slaughter, and how much was brilliant, calculated propaganda invented and encouraged by Genghis himself to force surrenders without wasting his own men's lives?
That's the terrifying genius of it. It's psychological warfare on a continental scale. He probably killed millions, yes, but he also likely saved his own army from endless sieges by making his reputation so horrifying that resistance felt mathematically pointless.
It was highly efficient.
If you can win a war through rumors and dust clouds, you are playing a completely different game than the general trying to bash down a wall with a rock.
The terror was a surgical tool, wielded with precision to achieve rapid capitulation, and it is deeply uncomfortable to reconcile, but this landscape of terror and ash, this scorched earth policy, laid the foundation for an unprecedented era of global connection.
It is the ultimate historical paradox. Out of the bloodiest conquests in human history came the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace.
The Pax Mongolica refers to the stabilizing effects of the Mongol Empire across the vast Eurasian territory they had conquered. Once the resistance was broken, once the exemplary massacres had done their work, an era of relative peace, extreme stability, and uniform law settled over the trade routes.
There is this famous quote from the time that perfectly captures the reality of this peace. It was said that a maiden bearing a massive nugget of gold on her head could wander safely throughout the entire realm, from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, without fear of being robbed or harmed.
Whether that is a slight exaggeration or not, it reflects a reality of immense enforced security. The Mongols fiercely protected the Silk Road.
We have to remember what trade looked like before Genghis Khan, right?
Yes. Traveling from Europe to China meant crossing dozens of petty kingdoms, paying exorbitant taxes at every single border, and risking death by local bandits constantly.
It was a logistical nightmare. It made large-scale, consistent trade incredibly risky and expensive.
The Mongols essentially unified the route under one overarching political authority, and the economic boom that followed was world-changing.
We are talking about the birth of true globalization here. The Silk Road wasn't just about moving physical silk or spices. It was an information superhighway.
Absolutely. Because of the security the Mongols provided, we see the exchange of paradigm-shifting technologies. Paper, the magnetic compass, and gunpowder move from east to west.
And many historians argue that this massive influx of new technologies and ideas helped directly spark the European Renaissance.
And the Mongols didn't just passively allow this trade, they facilitated it proactively. They established the YAM system.
Think of the YAM system not just as a postal service, but like the Internet's packet switching network. It was designed to ensure information and goods never degraded over a 5,000-mile journey.
That's an excellent way to frame it. They set up relay stations every 20 to 30 miles across the entire empire, stocked with fresh horses, food, and shelter.
So a rider could just keep going without a break.
Yes, an official messenger could ride a horse to exhaustion, arrive at a station, immediately jump onto a fresh horse, and keep riding.
It's how they collapsed space and time. A message from the Khan could travel across the continent in days instead of months. And for the merchants, they created the paisa.
The paisa was a physical tablet made of gold, silver, or iron, depending on your rank, that acted as a VIP passport.
Like a medieval TSA pre-check.
Precisely. If a merchant carried a paisa, it meant they were under the direct personal protection of the Khan. It granted them free lodging at the YAM stations, access to fresh horses, and, crucially, exemption from local taxes.
If a local bandit messes with a merchant holding a gold paisa, they aren't just robbing a trader. They are personally insulting Genghis Khan, and a tumen of 10,000 cavalry will show up to resolve the dispute.
It created supreme confidence in the market. They also standardized weights and measures to make trade smoother across different cultures.
And Genghis Khan's successor, his son Ojide, implemented a macroeconomic policy that is astonishing for its time. He would frequently pay merchants double or triple their asking price for their goods.
It was a very deliberate strategy.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Why would the most powerful ruler on earth voluntarily overpay for silk or spices? He could just take it.
He was subsidizing risk to stimulate the global market. He wanted to ensure that the most ambitious, risk-taking merchants in the world viewed the Mongol Empire as the ultimate, most lucrative destination.
That is wild.
He was creating a venture capital ecosystem for medieval trade. He knew that by overpaying, he would draw goods, technologies, and wealth from every corner of the globe directly to his capital.
It was an incredibly sophisticated economic strategy for a people who, a generation prior, were fighting over grazing rights.
It really was.
But we have to look at the dark biological reality of this connection, too. Because when you build an incredibly efficient, continent-spanning highway system, it doesn't just move silk, compasses, and diplomats.
No, it moves pathogens.
Right.
The very trade routes and yam relay stations that brought the compass to Europe also facilitated the devastating, rapid spread of the Yersinia pestis bacterium, the Black Death. Fleas carrying the plague traveled on the backs of marmots, horses, and rats hidden in grain shipments along the secure trade routes. The hyperconnectivity of the Pax Mongolica allowed the plague to travel rapidly from Asia into the Middle East and Europe, fundamentally altering human history yet again.
The same system that brought unprecedented wealth brought unprecedented biological devastation. It's also deeply interconnected.
It is.
But to maintain order over this massive, diverse transcontinental economy, you cannot just rely on cavalry and gold tablets. You need a universal set of rules. Which brings us to Genghis Khan's mysterious, overarching legal code, the Great Yasa.
The Yasa was the supreme oral law code of the Mongol Empire. After the Kurultai of 1206, Genghis Khan appointed his adopted brother, Shigi Kwatukwa, who was ironically a Tatar orphan adopted by Holun, as the supreme judge to oversee the recording and implementation of this law.
But the wild part about the Yasa is that the law itself was kept secret. It was recorded in a text called the Conquests, or the Blue Book, which was only accessible to the Mongol royal family and the highest officials.
There are no surviving physical copies of it today.
Everything we know about the Yasa comes from fragments recorded by outside observers, like Persian administrators or European travelers.
But what we do know reveals a code designed entirely around maintaining total social order, military discipline, and environmental preservation.
I need to push you on this concept of a secret law. This makes no logical sense to me. If I don't know what the speed limit is, how do I avoid getting a speeding ticket?
That's a good point.
If the Yasa is locked in a blue book that the peasants can't read, how do they follow it?
It's a vital question. While the physical text of the Conquests was restricted, the enforcement and the judgments were incredibly public. When someone was executed for theft, the reason was made known to everyone.
So it was learning by example.
It created a society built on highly visible precedent. You learn the law by watching what got your neighbor killed, and the punishments were absolute. It mandated the death penalty for theft, for adultery, for lying to a superior.
And some stranger ones too, right?
But also, surprisingly, for washing clothes and running water during a thunderstorm.
Right, which sounds completely absurd to a modern listener. Why is doing laundry a capital offense?
Because on the arid Mongolian steppe, water is the most precious, fragile resource in existence. Polluting a running stream with dirt and animal fat could sicken or kill a nomadic community downstream.
So it's public health.
Furthermore, there was a deep spiritual belief that thunderstorms were the physical manifestation of Tengri's anger, and polluting the water during a storm was a profound spiritual offense.
That makes a lot of sense.
The Yasa codified environmental protection and spiritual reverence out of sheer pragmatic survival necessity.
Pragmatism is the defining word for everything Genghis Khan built. Because the most shocking part of the Yasa isn't the death penalty for laundry, it's the institutionalized religious freedom.
Which was incredibly rare for the time.
Genghis Khan himself was a shamanist. He worshipped Tengri, the sky god, and consulted with shamans.
Yet the Yasa granted absolute religious freedom across the entire empire. Buddhists, Muslims, Nestorian Christians, Taoists, all were allowed to practice their faith without persecution.
He even gave the priests, monks, imams, and scholars total tax exemptions. He essentially made places of worship tax-free zones centuries before the modern era.
He was very curious about other faiths, too.
He even famously invited the Taoist sage Chuji to his camp in the Hindu Kush Mountains, traveling thousands of miles just to sit and debate philosophy and ask him if he had a potion for immortality.
And this is where we must be very careful not to project modern, progressive, democratic ideals onto a 13th century conqueror. His religious tolerance was not born out of a modern sense of universal human rights.
This is pragmatic.
It was born of two deeply practical calculations. First, he sought what historians jokingly call celestial insurance. He figured if there was a powerful god out there willing to offer a blessing, a protection, or a longer life, why alienate them?
Cover all your spiritual bases.
Second, and vastly more importantly, he understood the mechanics of occupation. He knew that forcing people to abandon their core beliefs is the fastest way to ignite a sectarian rebellion.
Right.
If you conquer a Muslim city and try to force them to convert to shamanism, they will fight an insurgency against you to the death. But if you let them keep their mosques, and if you exempt their imams from taxes, those imams are much more likely to preach acceptance of your political authority.
You co-opt the religious leaders to maintain civic order.
Exactly.
So we have a man who will slaughter an entire city if they disrespect his diplomat, but if you're a local monk who submits to his rule, you suddenly get a tax break and a gold passport. How do we reconcile this utterly ruthless warlord with a tax code and a religious policy that sounds oddly utopian?
We reconcile it by understanding that the yasa applied to absolutely everyone, including the royal family. It was a mechanism of supreme, unyielding order.
Nobody was above the law.
Genghis Khan demanded total political submission, but once you submitted, he provided a highly rational, predictable, orderly framework where you could live, worship, and trade peacefully. The duality is the entire point.
The extreme violence created the blank slate, and the Yasa built a new, highly efficient society upon it.
Well said.
And that profound duality, unimaginable destruction paired with visionary global governance makes judging his long-term legacy incredibly complicated. Which brings us to our final section, the lingering shadow. How do we quantify the impact of a man who literally changed the climate of the Earth?
You're referring to the Genghis the Green theory, which emerged from modern climate studies, most notably the research by Julia Pungratz at the Carnegie Institution for Science.
Yes, this study blew my mind. Walk us through the specific methodology here. How does a warlord cool the planet?
The methodology looked at historical ice cores and records of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Because the Mongols killed an estimated 40 million people, vast regions of heavily cultivated agricultural land across Asia and Eastern Europe were suddenly, violently abandoned.
The farmers were dead, so the plow stopped.
Exactly. And when millions of acres of farmland lie fallow for decades, nature reclaims it. Forests grew back over immense swaths of land. Trees, as they grow, act as carbon sinks, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere.
The data suggests that this massive forced reforestation scrubbed an estimated 700 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere.
To put that in perspective, 700 million tons is roughly equivalent to the entire world's annual demand for gasoline today.
He caused a measurable pre-industrial global cooling event. He permanently altered the Earth's atmosphere through sheer demographic subtraction.
It is a staggering, macabre environmental legacy, and it stands alongside his heavily debated genetic legacy.
Let's talk about that genetic study.
For a long time, a famous 2003 genetic study circulated claiming that 16 million modern men, about 1 in every 200 men alive today, carry a specific Y chromosome lineage, suggesting they are direct descendants of Genghis Khan himself.
The pop culture takeaway was that he was this prolific, lone genetic superpredator who seeded his DNA across a continent.
But our sources, specifically a recent deep dive by researchers detailed in the Jerusalem Post, point out a crucial biological nuance to this story that changes the narrative entirely.
Yes, the narrative of Genghis Khan personally fathering that many children is a biological oversimplification. The newer studies highlight that the spread of this specific Y chromosome haplogroup is much more likely the result of a phenomenon called social selection.
Right. Explain how social selection works in this context.
Well, it means the genetic spread wasn't just Genghis Khan himself. It was the result of multiple elite Mongol lineages, his sons, his grandsons, his great-grandsons, and his top generals intermingling over centuries across the frontiers of a massive, stable empire.
When an elite ruling class controls a vast territory for hundreds of years, they have better diets, lower infant mortality, and access to more reproductive partners.
Over a dozen generations, their genetic signature naturally amplifies due to these compounding social advantages. It reflects the demographic reality of long-term political consolidation by a ruling dynasty, not just the exploits of one man.
It's the empire's DNA persisting, not just the CEO's, and culturally his memory is just as fragmented as his genetics.
Definitely. If you travel to Mongolia today, he is the undisputed founding father. He's on their currency. The national airport is named after him, and there is a 131-foot gleaming steel statue of him on horseback pointing east.
He is revered as the visionary who brought law, writing, and unity to their people.
Conversely, if you look at the historical memory in the Arab world, in Russia or in parts of Eastern Europe, he is remembered primarily as a savage tyrant. He is the harbinger of apocalyptic destruction who burned libraries and set their civilizations back for centuries.
Think about how entirely subjective history is based on where your ancestors stood.
If your ancestors were merchants protected by the Pax Mongolica, safely trading spices across the Silk Road because of his laws, he's a hero of global trade.
If your ancestors lived in Nishapur or Merv, he's the ultimate monster who brought the apocalypse to their doorstep.
Which leads us to the deeper layer of our prompt and our entire discussion today. Was Genghis Khan a product of his brutal environment, or was he an exception to it?
I look at the boy in the wooden king, the boy whose father was poisoned, and I think he was absolutely forged by the brutal logic of the steppe. The betrayals, the starvation, the clan warfare taught him the rules of the game.
But he was an exception, because he flat out refused to accept its traditional boundaries. Everyone else on the steppe just wanted to lead the biggest clan. Genghis Khan wanted to eliminate the concept of clans entirely.
He permanently changed the rules of survival, of power, and of human nature.
He understood that the archaic, aristocratic structures of the past were entirely insufficient for the unified future he envisioned. He tore down the hierarchies not just out of malice, but because he saw them as inefficient and inherently disloyal.
He replaced them with a machine built on pure merit, unyielding discipline, and absolute law.
History loves to remember extremes. We want our historical figures to be neatly categorized as the blood-soaked warlord or the visionary unifier. But the truth of Genghis Khan exists uncomfortably somewhere in between the sword and the Silk Road.
He was a master of his world because he understood that to build something entirely unprecedented, you sometimes have to tear the old world down to its very foundations.
It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of how civilizations are sometimes built. Global progress and connectivity, in this historical instance, were inextricably linked to profound, calculated trauma.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. Let's go back to the Yasa Genghis Khan's strict code of law.
We discussed how it was kept entirely secret in the Blue Book. The physical text was seen only by the ruling elite.
Yet the common people across the empire followed it implicitly, day in and day out, modifying their behavior under the constant threat of death based on the public enforcement they witnessed.
They obeyed the boundaries of a rule book they were never allowed to read.
So ask yourself if the core logic, the algorithm, or the law that governs your life is a secret. If you only learn the rules by watching who gets punished, are you truly being governed?
Or are you just being conditioned to fear an invisible line? And what does that tell us about the nature of power, transparency, and the invisible systems of control in our own world today?
A truly chilling question to end on.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. If you enjoyed unpacking the mechanics of history with us, make sure to follow and subscribe, because we're only just beginning to uncover what's out there.